The fastest way to discover who really owns a building is to watch what happens when someone else tries to give it away. The smell of pine wood and fresh flowers hit me before I even stepped through the doors. For a moment, I honestly thought I had walked into the wrong place. My boots stopped on the polished stone entryway of Hale Ridge Ski Lodge as the sound of a string quartet drifted through the massive timber beam hall ahead of me. Soft golden lights glowed from chandeliers hanging 3 stories above the ballroom floor. White floral arrangements lined the center aisle. More than 100 guests sat in neat rows facing a decorated wedding arch positioned directly in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the snow-covered mountains. Nobody noticed me at first. Why would they? To them, I was just another man standing near the entrance. To me, every inch of that room felt like part of my family. I stood frozen as a woman in a wedding gown slowly walked down the aisle while guests smiled and turned to watch her. Cameras flashed. Music filled the room. The entire ceremony was already underway. Then I saw her, Rebecca Collins, standing proudly near the front row with a clipboard in her hand, and the kind of smile people wear when they think everything is going exactly according to plan. The president of the local HOA was directing staff, greeting guests, and acting as though she owned the place. My place. My $9 million ski lodge. For several seconds, I could not process what I was seeing. I had spent the last 6 weeks in Seattle negotiating a commercial development project. The lodge had been closed for private maintenance and seasonal upgrades. Only a handful of employees had access. Nobody had permission to host events. Nobody had permission to lease the property. Nobody had permission to invite over 100 wedding guests into the building. Yet there they were. Crystal glasses, catering tables, professional photographers, floral displays that must have cost tens of thousands of dollars. Somebody had planned this event for weeks. The smell of fresh cedar from the lodge walls mixed with expensive perfume and catered food as I slowly moved farther inside. A server carrying a tray of champagne glasses walked past me without a second glance. A wedding coordinator checked her watch and hurried toward the ballroom. Everything looked professionally organized. That was what made it so surreal. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not an accidental booking error. This was a full-scale wedding taking place inside a property that did not belong to any of the people attending it. Then Rebecca finally noticed me. Her smile disappeared instantly. The clipboard lowered slightly in her hands. For the first time all afternoon, she looked uncertain. I watched the color fade from her face as she realized exactly who had just walked through the front doors. Around us, the ceremony continued. The bride reached the front of the aisle. Guests remained focused on the couple. Nobody else seemed to understand what was happening, but Rebecca did. And judging by the expression on her face, she already knew this wedding was about to become the most expensive mistake of her entire life. SUA, my name is Jackson Hale, and every beam, stone, and timber inside that mountain lodge carried a memory long before it carried a price tag. People liked talking about what the property was worth. $9 million. Luxury destination. Premium ski retreat. Exclusive mountain venue. Those descriptions always missed the point. To me, it was never about the money. It was about my father. 40 years earlier, there had been nothing on that ridge except pine trees, snowdrifts, and a stubborn man with a vision nobody else could see. I still remember standing beside him during one of the first winters when I was barely tall enough to see over a workbench. The air smelled like fresh-cut cedar and wood smoke. Snowflakes drifted through the mountain air while generators hummed in the distance. My father spent years building that lodge piece by piece. He hauled supplies up roads that barely qualified as roads. He slept in temporary cabins during blizzards. He worked through freezing mornings when ice coated every tool in sight. Most people would have quit. He never did. Eventually, the structure emerged from the mountainside like it had always belonged there. Massive timber beams stretched overhead. Stone fireplaces warmed enormous gathering halls. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed views of snow-covered peaks that seemed to go on forever. When the first guests arrived decades ago, they were not paying for luxury. They were paying for an experience. They were paying to sit beside a fire while snow fell outside. They were paying to create memories with their families. That was what made the lodge special. Over the years, it became one of the most recognizable properties in the region. Families returned every winter. Children who learned to ski there eventually brought their own children. Marriage proposals happened beside the fireplace. Holiday traditions formed around those mountain weekends. Yet despite all its success, the lodge remained personal. After my father passed away, ownership transferred to me, but it always felt more like stewardship than ownership. My responsibility was not simply maintaining a building. My responsibility was protecting a legacy. Every season, I invested in improvements. Roof systems, heating upgrades, structural inspections, preservation work. The goal was always the same: keep the place standing for another generation. That was why the scene unfolding inside the ballroom felt so wrong. As I stood near the entrance watching strangers celebrate inside a space my family had spent decades protecting, memories kept colliding with reality. The polished wood floors beneath their feet were floors my father helped install. The stone fireplace behind the wedding guests had been built by craftsman he. The first time I met Rebecca Collins, she seemed perfectly reasonable. That was probably why so many people trusted her. She had the kind of polished confidence that made strangers feel comfortable within minutes. Firm handshake, friendly smile, always remembered names, always volunteered for community projects. If you only met her once, you would probably describe her as helpful. The problem was that Rebecca never viewed boundaries the way most people did. To her, ownership was less important than influence. If enough people wanted something, she believed it should happen. If enough residents supported an idea, she treated that support like authority. The first few years after she became HOA president, that attitude mostly created small problems. She argued with homeowners over landscaping. She pushed for new rules. She inserted herself into decisions that had nothing to do with the HOA. People complained, but they usually gave in because fighting her required more energy than agreeing with her. Then her attention shifted toward the mountain, toward my property. It started innocently enough, at least on the surface. She asked whether residents could occasionally use the lodge conference room for community meetings. I declined politely. The building operated as a private business and insurance restrictions limited access. She smiled and accepted the answer. A few months later she asked again. Then again. Each request arrived wrapped in a different justification. Community events, charity fundraisers, holiday gatherings. Every time I said no, she acted understanding. Yet something about the conversations always felt off. It was not disappointment I saw in her eyes. It was calculation, as though she was studying an obstacle rather than accepting a decision. Over time, I began hearing strange things from employees. Guests occasionally arrived believing they had been invited by the HOA. Residents claimed Rebecca had referred to the lodge as a community asset. One employee told me she overheard Rebecca explaining that the property should serve local homeowners because it sat within the same mountain region. None of it made legal sense, but it revealed how she thought. In her mind, proximity created entitlement. The more familiar people became with the lodge, the more she seemed to view it as an extension of her influence. Then came the annual winter festival. Hundreds of residents attended. Food vendors lined the streets. Music played through outdoor speakers. Snow covered the rooftops like powdered sugar. During a public speech near the town square, Rebecca thanked various community partners for supporting local events. Then she gestured toward the mountain ridge visible in the distance. "We are fortunate to have resources like the lodge as part of our community," she said. The crowd applauded. Most people probably never noticed the wording. I did. Part of our community. Not privately owned. Not independently operated. Just part of the community. A subtle distinction, but powerful. The more she repeated that narrative, the more people accepted it. Looking back now, I realized the wedding did not appear out of no. The transformation happened so gradually that most people never realized it was happening at all. That was Rebecca's real talent. She did not take control of things overnight. She introduced ideas slowly, wrapped them in friendly language, and repeated them until they sounded like facts. During the first year, she organized a neighborhood holiday gathering and casually mentioned how wonderful it would be if local residents had greater access to mountain venues. The next year, she hosted a planning meeting where she spoke about creating stronger community partnerships. By the third year, people were discussing the lodge as if it already played a role in community life. Every conversation moved the line a little farther. Every event made the assumption stronger. I first realized how far things had gone during a conversation with one of my maintenance supervisors. It was early winter. Snow covered the surrounding slopes, and the smell of fresh pine drifted through the cold mountain air. We were reviewing seasonal repair schedules when he casually mentioned that several residents had recently stopped by asking about upcoming HOA events at the property. I remember looking up from my paperwork and asking him what he meant. He shrugged and said they seemed surprised when staff explained no HOA events were scheduled. At the time, I dismissed it as confusion. Looking back, it was something else entirely. Rebecca had begun creating a new reality. A few months later, social media posts started appearing. Photos of the mountain. Photos of the lodge exterior. Photos taken from public roads with captions describing community treasures and shared resources. The wording was always careful. Never an outright claim. Never something directly false. Just enough implication to let people fill in the blanks themselves. Then came guided neighborhood tours. Residents walked through nearby areas while volunteers discussed local attractions. Somehow the lodge was always included in the conversation. People posed for photographs with the mountain in the background. They pointed toward the building while discussing future community possibilities. Nobody asked permission because nobody thought permission was necessary anymore. The most surprising part was how quickly assumptions replaced facts. New residents moved into the area and accepted whatever they were told. If someone mentioned that the lodge occasionally supported community activities, they believed it. If someone suggested the property had become part of the neighborhood identity, they believed that too. A story repeated often enough begins to sound true. Rebecca understood that better than anyone. Then my trip to Seattle created the opportunity she had been waiting for. 6 weeks away. Limited contact. Seasonal maintenance underway. The perfect situation for someone willing to push boundaries. According to employees I later interviewed, she started by telling people the property was largely in use during the upgrade period. Then she claimed special arrangements had been made. Then she implied approvals existed. Each statement became slightly bolder than the last. Event planners were contacted. Vendors were hired. Decorations were ordered. Contracts were signed. At some point, an engaged couple searching for a mountain venue entered the picture. Whether they knew the full story or not, I still do not know. What I do know is that by the time the wedding date arrived, hundreds of people believed they were attending a perfectly legitimate event. Nobody questioned the location. Nobody questioned the authority behind it. Rebecca had spent years laying the foundation. The wedding. The photograph arrived at 10:43 p.m. on a Thursday night. I remember the exact time because I was still sitting in a conference room overlooking downtown Seattle when my phone vibrated against the table. Outside the windows, rain streaked down the glass while city lights reflected across the wet streets below. The meeting had just ended. Most of the people around me were gathering laptops and heading for elevators when I glanced down at the message. The sender was one of my longtime employees, a maintenance supervisor named Eric. He rarely texted unless something required immediate attention. The message contained only a single sentence. "You need to see this." Attached below, it was a photograph. At first, I thought I was looking at the wrong building. Rows of white chairs filled the grand ballroom. Massive floral arrangements lined the center aisle. Decorative lighting hung from ceiling beams. A wedding arch stood directly in front of the mountain view windows. I stared at the image for several seconds before opening the next one. Then the next. Then the next. Every photograph made the situation worse. Catering trucks parked outside the main entrance. Workers unloading decorations. Event staff arranging place settings for hundreds of guests. Temporary signage directing visitors toward the ceremony location. The scale of it was staggering. This was not a small private gathering. This was a professionally organized wedding operation occupying nearly every major space inside the property. I immediately called Eric. He answered on the first ring. The background noise told me he was standing outside. Wind howled faintly through the phone while distant vehicle engines echoed nearby. "Tell me exactly what is happening," I said. There was a pause before he answered. "Rebecca has been telling everyone she had approval," he said. "Most of the vendors believe everything is legitimate." My stomach tightened. Approval from who? Another pause. That is the problem. Nobody seems to know. Over the next 20 minutes, he filled in details. Event planners had been visiting for weeks. Deliveries arrived almost daily. Temporary staff had been hired. Decorations continued appearing throughout the lodge. Most employees assumed management had authorized the event because so many people were involved. By the time questions started surfacing, the wedding was less than 48 hours away. I ended the call and sat motionless in the conference room. The smell of stale coffee lingered in the air. Somewhere down the hallway, A cleaning cart rolled across tile floors. My eyes remained fixed on the photographs glowing from my phone screen. One image showed the ballroom illuminated by warm decorative lighting. Another showed workers arranging floral displays around the fireplace my father helped design decades earlier. That image bothered me more than any of the others. The scene looked beautiful, professional, expensive, carefully planned. It looked like something people would remember for the rest of their lives. And it was happening inside a building that nobody had permission to use. A few minutes later, another message arrived from Eric. This one contained a photograph of a printed event schedule. Rehearsal dinner, guest arrivals, ceremony start time, reception timeline. Everything was listed in precise detail. At the very bottom, one handwritten note had been circled in red ink. Wedding begins Saturday at 2 p.m. I looked at the clock. If I left immediately, I could be back in the mountains before the ceremony started. For the first time that night, I stopped wondering how this had happened and started thinking about what I was going to do when I got there. I left Seattle less than an hour later. The city lights disappeared behind me as I pointed my truck east and began the long drive back toward the mountains. Rain tapped steadily against the windshield while traffic thinned with every passing mile. Most people would have waited until morning. Most people would have made phone calls first. I considered both options. Then I looked at the photographs again and kept driving. Somewhere ahead, hundreds of strangers were preparing to celebrate inside a property they had no right to occupy. Every minute I spent waiting gave the situation more time to grow. The highway stretched through the darkness like a ribbon of wet black asphalt. Headlights reflected off road signs and guardrails. Coffee cups accumulated in the passenger seat. Hours passed. Midnight turned into 2 in the morning. 2 became 4. By sunrise, the landscape had changed completely. The city skyline was gone. Pine forests covered the hillsides. Snow appeared along the shoulders of the road. The air became colder, cleaner, familiar. I rolled down the window for a few seconds and breathed in the scent of mountain pine and fresh snow. It reminded me why I loved the place. It also reminded me what was at stake. Around mid-morning, I stopped at a roadside diner near the state line. The smell of bacon and fresh coffee filled the building. Truck drivers sat in booths watching weekend sports coverage on mounted televisions. I took a corner table and opened my laptop. If I was going to walk into a wedding already in progress, I wanted every document ready. Ownership records, property insurance, business registrations, county filings, security access logs. I downloaded everything onto multiple devices and forwarded copies to my attorney. 20 minutes later, she called. Her voice sounded calm, which was one of the reasons I trusted her. After listening to the situation, she gave me the same advice she always gave. Stay calm. Stay professional. Let the paperwork do the talking. We reviewed ownership documentation one final time before ending the call. The facts were simple. The property belonged to me. No event authorization existed. No lease existed. No rental agreement existed. No verbal promise existed. The law was not complicated. The challenge would be dealing with people who had spent months convincing themselves otherwise. By early afternoon, the mountain roads began climbing higher. Snow-covered peaks appeared beyond the tree-line. Familiar landmarks emerged one by one. The old gas station near the valley entrance. The frozen lake overlooking the ridge. The overlook where my father used to stop whenever visitors came to town. Every mile made me more determined. Not angry. Determined. There is a difference. Anger clouds judgment. Determination sharpens it. I did not want revenge. I wanted accountability. The closer I got to the property, the more messages arrived from employees. Additional photographs. Additional updates. Guest vehicles filling parking areas. Decorations completed. Vendors arriving. One photograph showed the ballroom fully prepared. Another showed guests beginning to gather. Then the final image arrived. The bride had arrived. The ceremony would begin within the hour. I looked at the timestamp and tightened my grip on the steering wheel. Snow-covered mountains rose around me as the road curved toward the ridge. The lodge was only minutes away now. For 6 weeks, Rebecca had been building toward this moment. She thought she controlled the story. She thought everyone important was already inside that ballroom. What she did not know was that the actual owner had just turned onto the final mountain road leading home. The music stopped before I said a single word. I did not ask for it to stop. It simply happened the way conversations stop when someone unexpected walks into a room carrying a truth nobody wants to hear. The final notes from the string quartet faded beneath the vaulted timber ceiling as dozens of heads slowly turned toward the entrance. For a few seconds, nobody seemed to understand why. Then people began noticing where everyone else was looking. I continued walking down the side aisle at a steady pace. The polished wood floor reflected the warm chandelier light above. The scent of fresh flowers and cedar filled the air. Guests exchanged confused glances. A photographer lowered his camera. A caterer paused near the back wall. The bride and groom stood beneath the wedding arch, staring in my direction with expressions that shifted from confusion to concern. Rebecca recovered first. She always did. I watched her straighten her posture and step forward with the confidence of someone who had spent years controlling rooms exactly like this one. "Jackson," she said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "this is not the time." Her tone suggested I was interrupting something that belonged to her. I stopped several feet away and looked around the ballroom. More than 100 people sat waiting for an explanation. Some smiled nervously. Others appeared annoyed. Most had no idea who I was. "Actually," I said calmly, "this is exactly the time." The room grew even quieter. I could hear the faint crackling from the fireplace across the hall. Outside the enormous windows, snow drifted gently across the mountain slopes. Rebecca crossed her arms. "You are disrupting a private event," she said. "If you have concerns, we can discuss them later." Several guests nodded in agreement. From their perspective, she sounded reasonable. From my perspective, she was standing in a building she had no authority to use while accusing me of causing a disturbance. The irony was almost impressive. "A private event?" I asked. "That is interesting." Rebecca's expression tightened slightly. "Yes," she replied. "A private event." I glanced around the ballroom one more time. Every chair, every floral arrangement, every table setting, every decoration sat inside a property my family had owned for decades. Then I looked directly at her. "Rebecca, who gave permission for this event to take place here?" For the first time, she hesitated. It lasted less than a second, but I noticed. So did several guests near the front row. "The community has used this facility before," she answered. "Not permission, not authority, not approval. A completely different statement." "That was not my question," I said. The silence returned. I could feel the atmosphere changing. People were beginning to realize this was not a simple disagreement. This was a question with a real answer. Rebecca opened her mouth, closed it, then tried a different approach. "Jackson, you are embarrassing yourself." I almost laughed. Instead, I reached into my briefcase and removed a thick folder containing documents I had prepared during the drive home. Ownership records, business registrations, county filings, insurance documentation, everything. The guests nearest me immediately noticed the paperwork. Rebecca noticed it too, and judging by the way the color slowly drained from her face, she finally understood something that everyone else in the room was only beginning to realize. This conversation was no longer about opinions. It was about facts. Rebecca tried to regain control of the room. I could see it happening in real time. Her shoulders straightened. Her smile returned. She stepped forward and gestured toward the guests as though the entire situation could still be managed with confidence alone. "This is a misunderstanding," she announced. "Everything has been arranged properly." A few people seemed relieved to hear that. Others were not so sure anymore. The atmosphere had changed. Questions were spreading through the ballroom faster than answers. I opened the folder and removed the first document. The sound of paper sliding across the table seemed unusually loud beneath the silence. "This is the property deed," I said. "Filed with the county. Recorded under Hale Ridge Holdings." I placed it on a nearby table where several guests could see it. Then came the insurance documents. Then the business registration. Then the ownership records. Every page carried the same conclusion. The lodge belonged to me. Not the HOA. Not the community. Not Rebecca Collins. Me. The bride looked toward the groom. The groom looked toward the event coordinator. The event coordinator looked toward Rebecca. Nobody seemed comfortable anymore. One of the photographers quietly lowered his camera. Near the back of the room, a caterer stopped arranging glasses and simply watched. Rebecca attempted another explanation. She spoke about community partnerships, shared access, local traditions. The problem was that none of those things answered the actual question. Permission. Every road led back to the same issue. Who had authorized the wedding? The answer remained painfully absent. Then the front doors opened. Several people turned immediately. The cold mountain air drifted into the ballroom, carrying the scent of fresh snow. Two sheriff's deputies entered accompanied by a county representative. Their arrival was calm and professional. No raised voices. No dramatic scene. Just officials performing a routine verification. The county representative greeted me first. We had already spoken by phone during my drive back. I handed over copies of the ownership documents. The deputies reviewed identification and property records. The process took only a few minutes, but it felt much longer inside that silent ballroom. Guests whispered among themselves. Chairs creaked. Somewhere near the fireplace, someone nervously cleared their throat. Finally, the county representative closed the folder and nodded. "Ownership has been verified," he said. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Every conversation stopped. Every excuse disappeared. Every assumption suddenly collided with reality. Rebecca opened her mouth as though she wanted to argue, but nothing came out. There was nothing left to challenge. The records were clear. The permissions never existed. The event had been organized under authority that nobody actually possessed. The deputies remained courteous as they explained the situation. The ceremony could not continue on private property without authorization from the owner. Vendors began making phone calls. Guests started gathering personal belongings. Confusion slowly turned into disappointment. The bride looked devastated. I genuinely felt sorry for her. She was not the villain in this story. Most of the people inside that room were not. They had trusted the wrong person. As rows of chairs gradually emptied and conversations filled the ballroom once more, I looked toward Rebecca. For years, she had convinced people that influence and ownership were the same thing. In less than 10 minutes, a stack of county documents had destroyed that illusion completely. 3 months later, winter arrived in full force. Snow blanketed the mountain ridges, covering the forests and roads in a layer of white that seemed to erase every trace of the chaos that had unfolded that afternoon. From a distance, the lodge looked exactly the same as it always had. The stone walls stood firm against the cold. Warm light glowed through the massive windows. Smoke drifted from the chimneys into the crisp mountain air. Yet everything felt different. The weeks following the wedding had changed more than most people expected. Once the facts became public, conversations spread quickly through the community. Residents who had trusted Rebecca began asking questions. Vendors wanted explanations. Event planners wanted documentation. Members of the HOA board wanted answers about how such a large event had been organized without proper authorization. Every discussion eventually reached the same conclusion. Assumptions had replaced facts. Confidence had replaced authority. And nobody had bothered to verify either until it was too late. Rebecca resigned from her position before the end of the season. The announcement appeared in a short community newsletter. No dramatic statement. No public defense. Just a brief notice thanking her for years of service and announcing a leadership transition. After everything that had happened, the silence surrounding her departure felt strangely appropriate. The community moved on. Most communities eventually do. The bride and groom found another venue several weeks later. Through mutual acquaintances, I learned they were able to hold a beautiful ceremony surrounded by family and friends. That news genuinely made me happy. They had been caught in the middle of a situation they never created. They deserved a better ending than the one they were given that afternoon. As for the lodge, operations returned to normal. Guests arrived for ski season. Families gathered around the fireplaces. Children tracked snow across the entryways before racing back outside. Laughter once again filled the great hall. The building resumed doing what it had always done, creating memories. One evening near the end of December, I found myself standing alone on the balcony overlooking the valley. The air was cold enough to sting my face. Below me, thousands of tiny lights from nearby towns flickered against the darkness. The scent of pine and wood smoke drifted through the night. Somewhere inside, guests were enjoying dinner while a piano player performed near the fireplace. The sounds carried faintly through the open balcony door behind me. I rested my hands on the railing and looked toward the snow-covered slopes beyond the property. My father used to stand in this exact spot after long workdays. Back then, there was no luxury lodge, no successful business, no community reputation, just an unfinished dream sitting on top of a mountain. He believed some things were worth protecting because they represented more than money. Standing there, I finally understood exactly what he meant. The lodge had survived storms, recessions, difficult winters, and decades of change. It had survived because somebody cared enough to defend it when necessary. Ownership was never about having your name on a piece of paper. Ownership was responsibility, stewardship, preservation. The wedding had come and gone. The arguments had ended. The headlines had faded. But the lesson remained. Just because someone acts like they own something does not make it theirs. As snow continued falling softly across the mountains, I looked back through the windows at the warm glow filling the lodge and smiled. The mountain remembered who built this place. And now, so did everyone else.